Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Historical Geology 1404. We are continuing Module 2. Today, we are learning about environments and life. That is, what environments does life live in? We've already learned about sedimentary environments, and you will see a lot of overlap, right? How to interpret those environments using sedimentology and stratigraphy and all of those things. We will be revisiting some of those subjects. But today's specific emphasis is more along the lines of what things can live in those environments and how those things can lend extra data to interpret those environments. Okay? So last time we talked about how life theoretically began. Did it start here? Did it start somewhere else? Regardless, life is here now. And it has become so ingrained in the world and our planet. It is fundamental to so many geological principles here that we cannot study one without studying the other. Okay? To varying degrees. People who spend their lives studying metamorphic rocks will need less experience or research into biology than someone that studies sedimentary rocks, right? So it's situational. But even there's some overlap no matter where you go in geology. Okay. We talked about evolution, right? Someone remind me what evolution is.
The changes in species over time.
Changes in species over time. Yes, thank you. That's a very good summary. All right. Have you ever heard the term adaptation? What is adaptation? And is it different from evolution? If so, why?
Like adaptation is depending on the environment.
Adaptation depends on the environment. I like that. But tell me what adaptation is. Yeah? Louder. Something that's actively happening. Do you mean like more noticeably happening, like in the short term? Something that can be observed versus something that happens over generations? Is that what you're referring to? Yes, actually, that's also good. Adaptation can occur over generations, but is not, it can also just happen within a single lifetime or within a single moment, really, when you think about it. Who's warm right now? Why are you warm? Yeah, it's about 50-something degrees outside. It's not that much hotter in this room. And so a lot of you are wearing jackets or sweaters or hoodies or whatever. Therefore, you are warm. Why did you put on that sweater or jacket or hoodie today? Because you were cold. Adaptation. You adapted to your environment. You made a change to yourself based upon an environmental input, and you are now warm. Now, let's say I turn the thermometer up in here, or the thermostat up in here about 20 degrees. What would you do? Take that jacket off, right? You would adapt again. So adaptation can occur on very small scales within a matter of moments, right? Especially when you have the freedom to do something like take off a layer, right? Or put on a layer again. Adaptation to your environment can also occur in the long run. For example, we have elephants, right? And yet, these elephants have some fur, but not much. But 40,000 years ago, elephants had a lot of fur, right? You think they could just take off their sweater when it warmed up? No. And so this is where adaptations and evolution start to mix. Because an animal that can adapt to its environment and become successful in that environment, that is the jumping off point for a new evolutionary trait. Okay? Let's continue with the subject of elephants. based off of our conversation last time we met, tell me what happened that caused woolly mammoths to no longer have fur, elephants to no longer have fur and become the elephants that we have today. Okay, there was an environmental change. Things started warming up. Why would that matter to the elephant's DNA? Do you think the elephant's DNA cares that it's getting warmer outside? Do you think it notices?
It's dying. The elephant is going to die.
Okay, but if an elephant is dying, do you think the DNA is going to make the conscious choice to do something different?
No, it was the fact that like the elephants without fur survived more and were able to reproduce more than the other ones.
Let's come back to that thought in a moment. Hold that thought. What'd you say? Fair enough. You said there was something random. What happened randomly? The DNA changed. Why?
Mutation.
Probably a radiation input. Yeah, something changed here. And that radiation did something to the DNA that caused what? Less fur, less hair. And what did that mean, Deliana?
The ones with less fur were able to survive more and reproduce more.
A positive adaptation. A positive adaptation that allowed a single organism that experienced that mutation to become more successful than its brethren around it, or sisterin, I guess, right? I don't know which one it happened to. But that gene, because it made that organism more successful, got passed on 2 more generations. Less fur as things get warmer means more successful. More fur, you get too hot, you overheat, you die. And so as time goes on and that gene gets passed along and further hair loss occurs as a result of the continuation of this gene, you end up with our modern day elephants, which are practically furless. Still just a little bit, but not terribly even noticeable, right? Okay, adaptation can add up to an evolutionary change. So the inputs that encourage adaptation, food is a huge one. How many living things do you know of on our planet that don't need food? Nothing. Every living thing that we know of requires some nutritional input. It's part of that self-regulation that we discussed as a requirement for something to be alive, right? A virus doesn't need to eat anything. Matter of fact, viruses can lie dormant for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. We have found viruses in ice that have been there for hundreds of thousands of years. You could put viruses in space and they'd be just fine. They don't need food. They have a single one-program mission. You remember that? Destroy cells and replicate themselves. So, all things need food. All living things need food. What happens if your food source goes away? What are your options?
Find a new one.
Find a new food source or
Create your own.
die.
Oh.
I'm going to say that moving is incorporated into finding a new food source, because what's your motivation for moving? Finding a new food source. Okay? That is one way you could do it. You could start eating something else in your environment, or you could go somewhere else to find another food source, or you could die. Right? That's always an option. Right? All the chocolate in town is sold out. There's none left. I'm just going to die. Right? Or you could just buckle down and actually eat Skittles. Whatever, right? Chocolate superior to Skittles. Not so hot take, I'd bet. All right. So, What about okay, what's another way that your food source could go away? Your food source could experience an environmental change that kills it that doesn't really affect you, right? If I'm a human and I can live within a 50-degree temperature range comfortably, but my primary food source, sheep, let's just say sheep, okay? If I am a sheep herder and they're my main source of food and temperatures jump 10 degrees on average, I can live within that. But the sheep covered in fur overheat and die. My sheep flocks start to die off. My food source is depleting, right? So there can be an environmental change that affects the source of food that does not affect the organism that we are looking at in particular, okay? Or there can be another input. Can anyone tell me about another thing that can happen to a food source? Overhunted. Good. That's a fantastic example. When a predator or say humans, I guess you could label us as predators. Let's just say predators for the sake of being concise today. When predators overhunt their population of prey, yes, you lose so much prey that your prey may very well go extinct, or at least drop to a number that cannot sustain the predator population. And therefore there is a die-off effect. What else?
The food source could change itself.
Ooh, your food source adapts. Yeah. So what happens, that's actually a really good example because we'll talk about some of those later on. What happens when your food source, because you are an environmental factor for that food source, what happens if that food source develops a defense, right? What happens if your favorite, let's say you're a horse and your favorite weed, all of a sudden there's a new gene that gets spread through that gene pool of those weeds and now they grow thorns. Ooh, not so nice for your mouth, is it? What are your options? Adapt or die, right? That's today's theme. Adapt or die. I should make bumper stickers. Okay. What about another thing? There's one more that I'm looking for in particular. Curious to see if we get there. Huh? Say it louder. Crop failure. That has more to do with agriculture. So relevant really only to us. I mean, kind of, yeah. Disease. Disease is absolutely an environmental factor. But as far as predator-prey relationships go is what I'm looking at here. Okay.
A flood.
Okay, we're talking about other environmental stuff. So we'll move on to all this stuff in just a second. Natural disasters, absolutely an environmental. New disease moves in, absolutely an environmental factor. But the one I was looking for when it comes to predator-prey relationships, to food sources, what happens when new competition moves in? What if I am a pack of hyenas and I rely upon a specific herd of gazelle to sustain my hyena pack? We kill one every couple of days, but this pack of gazelle, this herd of gazelle is so big that we can take one every couple of days, and their birth rate is such that they maintain about the same population, right? What happens if a pride of lions moves in? They also are going to be preying on those gazelles. And now those gazelles are being utilized at a rate faster than the herd can sustain itself. And on top of that, I have to watch out for the lions now, right? New predators moving in, competition for that food source. It's a huge factor, something that we will talk about. Okay. You mentioned things like natural disasters, absolutely a factor. When that famous asteroid came and hit the planet and wiped out the dinosaurs, it struck off the coast of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, making what we call the Chicxulub crater. It's named after a nearby town on the Yucatan Peninsula named Chicxulub. When it struck, it put a whole bunch of ash and dust up in the atmosphere. Yes, there was a massive tsunami. Yes, there was a huge fireball that killed a lot of stuff in the immediate area. But the big thing that affected the entire world was that dust cloud. What did the dust cloud do? It spread through the atmosphere, but what did it do? It blocked the sun. It didn't get pitch dark, but it probably turned the skies orange for a while, right? You block enough UV radiation from the sun, what starts to happen? What's the next natural, bless you, what's the next natural effect? Plants start to die. Why? What are plants doing? They're photosynthesizing. You don't get enough rays from the sun. Specifically, you don't get enough of... Do you guys know why plants are green?
Chlorophyll?
No, actually. Chlorophyll doesn't make them green. Chlorophyll is just a chemical. Chlorophyll plays a role in why they are green, but it is not why. Huh? Start with a what? C? No.
It gets the light better.
Plants that utilize UV radiation from the sun are absorbing every wavelength of light except green. Green is the wavelength they are reflecting, which is why plants are typically green. When you see a plant that is red, or a plant that is blue, or a plant that is whatever, that is the wavelength of light that it is reflecting. So what does that mean? Well, there's a couple of very interesting things, not the least of which is if we ever did find photosynthesizing organisms on another world, they would probably be a totally different color. Purple plants being normal on another world. Totally possible. Because that's the wavelength that they reflect. Whereas on Earth, most plants reflect green because that's how it started. Okay? That was a fun side note, huh? I'm sorry, say it louder. It's not that it's random. It's that the most likely reason why is that the first photosynthesizing organisms, or maybe not even the first, at some point in the past, a photosynthesizing organism experienced a mutation that was positive that absorbed every wavelength except green. Maybe green was not particularly friendly wavelength for that organism. Maybe it was a totally random color choice. Not a choice, totally random color exclusion. Okay? But whatever the reason, most plants these days are green because that's the wavelength they reflect. If plants were white, then they would be reflecting every wavelength, not absorbing them. Right. If all plants were black, that means that they would be absorbing every wavelength of light. And there may be an argument that a black plant is the most effective photosynthesizer. I don't know.
But it wouldn't be.
I'm not a botanist. Why don't they burn up now? There's not enough radiation, right? I mean, plants do dry out, right? You need to keep that balance of humidity, water input, right? So that they can regulate that energy, that thermal energy. But no, if in the right conditions, a black plant could theoretically work. Again, I'm not a botanist, so I can't explore the benefits of a black plant. But in theory, it would be more efficient, absorbing more wavelengths and getting more photosynthesis done. Regardless, let's bring it back from that tangent. All the plants that were absorbing radiation from the sun, they started to die off because most of their wavelengths of light were gone. What's making it through the atmosphere? Think about what the sun looks like during a sunset or a sunrise. Oranges, reds. It's really the only wavelengths making it through the atmosphere. No blues, okay? No, not much yellow, probably, right? Those higher energy wavelengths aren't making it through the atmosphere, only lower energy wavelengths. And so temperatures start to fall. Not only do plants not photosynthesize as much as they could, but temperatures start to fall, which kills off even more plants and starts to kill off animals. Food chains start to collapse as the herbivores can't eat the plants because the plants are dying faster than they need them to. Okay? Carnivores start losing their herbivorous prey. It started to affect the entire food chain, and then everything collapsed, and we ended up with the extinction that killed off the dinosaurs. Natural disasters play a huge role in the ways that these things can play out. Okay? What we just talked about was a cascade effect of adaptation failures. Can things adapt to natural disasters? Not typically in time to survive them. Really, the only way to survive is normally if you already have an adaptation that is beneficial or positive enough that you can survive with it, or you're far enough away that you're not affected. Pretty much everything on Earth was affected by this particular disaster. But what survived? What's one very important organism that survived? Very relevant to you and me. Mammals. Our ancestors survived. Remember what I told you before? Mammals have been around for as long as the dinosaurs, practically. Not in the same form, but still mammals. Huh? Yeah, tiny little rodent-looking dudes. For most of the time that dinosaurs were around. We survived, though. Why? We had a few distinct advantages. Mostly, we ate bugs, right? The little rat dudes, they ate bugs. Bugs are totally fine during this asteroid apocalypse. Dinosaurs are getting wiped out. Bugs are doing just fine. So mammals' main food source, also good. Where do we live? Underground. Pretty easy habitat to maintain regardless of the disaster happening. We weren't photosynthesizing. We weren't particularly dependent on certain plants to survive. Because of a few distinct adaptations, which most likely we had developed to survive in a world dominated by dinosaurs, we survived and they didn't. How's that for a success story? I should do a TED Talk.
Now they're the small ones, the chickens.
Yeah, now they're chickens and we eat them for nuggets, right? All right, where was I? I keep going down these tangential thoughts, right? Different climatic conditions, changes in ocean or air chemistry can spark a need for an adaptive change. Temperature, moisture, those are huge. What happens if you go from a, say, nearshore environment or a rainforest environment, and it starts to dry out, and gradually over the course of thousands of years, all of a sudden we're working with an arid environment, like a desert. It happens, right? Tectonics could make something happen. Global temperature changes can make something happen. Life has to adapt or die. Okay. A habitat, by the way, for those of you that don't know, a habitat is an area that is inhabitable by life. There's nothing in this that describes what kind of life is there, just that there is life. There are habitats at the bottom of the deepest sea, of the deepest ocean, I should say. There are habitats high up in the atmosphere. There are little airborne single-celled organisms that survive tens of thousands of feet up in our atmosphere. Do you know that? You can take an air sample up there, and you'll find little dudes living in the atmosphere, just suspended in the air. It's crazy. All right. Ecology is the study of life in those habitats, in the environments that they live in, within that boundary, okay? So let's talk about some terminology. Ecology is the general study of life within those boundaries. We define those boundaries by a couple of other words. A niche, N-I-C-H-E, a niche is a space within that boundary that is occupied by an organism fulfilling a function. Think of an apartment building, okay? There's an apartment building with 50 apartments. We would call that an ecosystem, right? We have an ecosystem defined within the bound of this apartment building. Each of those 50 apartments is a niche occupied by an organism. You have your organisms that absorb light and provide basic nutrition to a few herbivorous animals, okay? So some form of plant, okay? Fulfilling that function within the ecosystem. Then you've got another niche occupied by the organisms that eat that plant. They take that producer, that plant, consume it for their own energy. And then you have another niche occupied by the things that eat that, okay? Niches, spaces within an ecosystem that are occupied by an organism, okay? When I say this niche was left empty, what does that mean? That apartment is empty. The former inhabitants are gone. They died off. They couldn't cut it. They're gone. Empty niche, by the way, perfect opportunity for something to adapt and fill that niche. Most of the time, niches don't get filled while there's something already living there. It does happen. When it does, that's competition. And then it's, whoever ends up being the most ideal for that niche. But when a niche is left vacant because that organism could not cut it, whatever the change was, something else will almost immediately adapt to fill that niche, because guess what? Living space, very limited. I don't know if none of you are probably old enough to have ever done any kind of apartment hunting or house hunting. It's rough right now, okay, to find anything within a price range. And so when there's an opening in this apartment, let's say this is an LA apartment. If you don't know, that increases the stakes a lot, okay? So let's say that this is now an apartment building in LA. As soon as there's that opening, something swoops in there and fills that niche, okay? Free real estate. You guys remember that commercial? Okay. Population. When I say population, what that means is a group of individuals within a specific area. That means you and me, all of us in this room right now, are a population. This room, the bounds of this room, has a population of us. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 humans. Okay? Yes, 11. I was like, wait. Okay, 11 humans are the population of this room. Plus, who knows how many little bugs are scurrying around in here. I probably have some spiders in the corner, right? If we expand the boundaries of our area to this entire wood math sciences building, we've probably got anywhere around 150 to 200 humans, plus one snake and a turtle, right? In my office over there. However, that snake and turtle are not part of our, how do I put this? Yeah, they are not part of our population. Not just because they're not part of the same species, but because there's something entirely different, okay? They don't occupy the same niche, okay? And we can be as specific as we want. If I had, I don't know, a chimpanzee in here, you could make an argument that we occupy most of the same niche space, right? Or a pig, interestingly enough. Pigs utilize most of the same resources at the same rates, in the same quantities, have the same needs, temperature, intervals that they can live in. We share a lot in common with pigs. Also, genetically, we share a lot in common with pigs. When you get a skin graft, let's say that you have a really bad burn victim, a lot of the replacement flesh that is used to fix that person is pig skin, because you can graft it to human skin and it's nearly indiscernible. Okay? So we share a lot in common with pigs. We share a lot of the same niche space with pigs. Okay? So a population is a group of individuals within an area. A community is a group of populations, right? So now I would say, okay, we have a community of humans, 150 to 200 humans in this building. We have, or excuse me, a population. Now we have a community of populations within this building. That community of populations includes humans, bugs, snakes, and turtles. Possibly some rodents, but I've never seen them, but there is always the potential that there could be, right? Any living thing within the bounds of this area is part of the community, part of the ecosystem, all right? Any questions about that terminology? Great. All right. Now, we see that there tends to be bands of environments around our planet. Why does it form an banded structure? Earth is a sphere, right? What's going around the middle?
Equator?
Yeah, association with the equator and the poles. Am I closer to the poles? Am I closer to the equator? Okay. So there are different environments. You see more rainforests around the equator. That makes sense. Savannas, grasslands, about middle latitudes. Okay. Also deserts. Lots of mid-latitude deserts, right? Then the closer you get to the poles, you move into your tundra, and then eventually your polar deserts. Okay. These occur in these bands around the planet, leading away from the equator, both in the north and southern hemisphere. There is a distinct association, very obvious association, between how the degree of diversity and quantity of organisms that live closer to the equator versus the poles. Okay? It's almost exponential. The closer you get to the equator, the greater the increase in genetic diversity is. The further you get from the equator, the less there is. Interestingly enough, this is also true for elevation. The higher you go in elevation, the less things there are living up there. And of those things that live up there, the less genetic diversity there is. The lower you get in elevation, the greater the diversity and quantity of organisms that live. There is some association with the amount and diversity of living things and sea level / the equator. And people are still working on trying to quantify exactly why that association exists. In your mind, you're like, well, it's obviously there's more humidity, there's better temperatures. Yeah, but quantify that for me, define it for me, explain it to me. We just take that for granted because it's common sense. But if you can't give me a data breakdown of what's common sense, then we haven't explained it yet. So people are working on that right now. It's a big mystery. Not so much a mystery as much as a fun problem to figure out, right? Okay. All right. Let's talk about the atmosphere. This extraordinarily thin layer of gases, this envelope of gases that surrounds our planet that we are lucky enough to have, right? This particular recipe of atmosphere that we are breathing right now, right? Don't stop breathing it. We're kind of addicted, right? Huh? Addicts. Yes, we are atmosphere addicts. Very true. Now, our atmosphere is a very, very delicate combination, important ratio of gases. What gases are in our atmosphere?
Nitrogen, oxygen.
Nitrogen?
What's the most common one? Which gas makes the most of our atmosphere?
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen. 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. Then?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. And then trace gases, the largest of which is argon. Okay. So funny. Yes, argon. Okay. What do we need? What do you and I need to support our bodies out of these gases? Oxygen? Are we all agreed? Oxygen is the only thing we need here?
Nitrogen.
There's not really enough hydrogen to...
Not nitro.
Believe it or not, we actually do utilize some of that nitrogen. Most of it is expelled again, but we do absorb some of it. Okay? I don't suppose any of y'all have any experience with scuba diving. You do? Okay. You took a class at some point, I assume?
Yeah, we went to Cancun and we had to take like a week of preparation and then go on the cruise.
That sounds really fun. Oh, man, I'd love to do that. I've been scuba diving a few times. Never been to Cancun, though. It sounds really cool. When you did your scuba diving training, did they tell you about what happens if you go below 75 feet? Yes. If you descend below 75 feet in the water while scuba diving, you always, on your way back up, have to stop at 75 feet for at least 15 minutes before continuing upward. Why? Because the pressure below 75 feet has climbed to the point where, while it may not be uncomfortable for you, it has caused the nitrogen, which is normally dissolved in your bloodstream, to start forming bubbles in your veins. As those nitrogen bubbles form, as you are rising back up to the surface, if you rise too quickly, then they clog up your veins, form blockages, and you die from cardiac arrest. Very, very severe cases of that will kill you. Most of the time when that happens, you're left with what is called the bends. And the bends are when your veins have suffered so much damage and your joints have suffered so much damage because of the nitrogen bubbles collecting there as well, that you are left crippled in some way. Some people can never walk again. Some people lose the function of their entire lower body. Some people lose the function of an arm. Sometimes it can lead to brain damage. But that is why if you ever go scuba diving, your scuba instructor will always carefully make you stay at that depth for at least 15 minutes to allow the nitrogen bubbles to redissolve back into your bloodstream. Okay? We absorb that nitrogen that we breathe in, a lot of it. Okay? It is there. All of these gases in our atmosphere, some of it we breathe, some of it we use, like that oxygen, but most of that oxygen is tied up in other things. Remember how I told you last time how oxygen is extremely reactive? Oxygen loves being attached to other things, carbons, sulfurs, nitrogens, okay? It'll be attached to whatever it can get to. It loves to bond with stuff, iron, right? It wants to make rust. It wants to be attached to hydrogens and make water. Oxygen, extremely reactive. The only reason why we have so much oxygen in our atmosphere right now is because of billions of years of volcanic eruptions, spewing it up into the atmosphere. And then life. Photosynthetic algae, bacterial colonies, absorbing the methanes and the carbon dioxides and the sulfur dioxides and the ammonias, cracking them apart through chemosynthesis, spitting out that oxygen. I don't care about that oxygen. You go back out there to the atmosphere. I want that carbon if I'm a plant. I want that nitrogen or phosphorus if I'm a bacteria, right? Spitting the oxygens back out, filling the atmosphere with oxygen for billions of years to give us the exact composition that we have now that we need to breathe. The other things in our atmosphere, the heavier molecules, like carbon dioxide, we call those greenhouse gases. You've heard this term before. I've mentioned it before. What's a greenhouse gas?
A gas that can't really be dissolved well in the atmosphere.
Can't really be dissolved well in the atmosphere. We're not going to go with that definition. There's some potential to explore there, but let's look for another definition.
A house that traps the gas.
It's a house that traps green gases, right? That's obviously the answer. No.
It traps the heat inside of the planet.
It traps heat inside of the planet, you say. Why would it do that? How rude.
Like when the sun beams hit, I guess they reflect in the atmosphere and stay in the planet. I don't know how to explain it.
All right, well, let's walk through it piece by piece, shall we? Radiation from the sun hits our atmosphere. Much of it gets reflected. Much of it never even makes it to the atmosphere because of the magnetic field. But what does make it through the magnetic field, what doesn't get reflected off the outer layer of atmosphere, pierces through the atmosphere, hits the surface of our planet. Some of it gets absorbed. A lot of it gets reflected back out into space. Greenhouse gases are large gas molecules, dense enough, have enough mass that when that reflected light hits it, it absorbs some of that energy, and that light is reflected back to the surface and just bounces back and forth until all that energy is absorbed. It's ping-ponging back and forth. The more greenhouse gases, therefore, that we have in the atmosphere, the more heat Earth retains. By the way, a very, very common greenhouse gas on our planet, water vapor. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, what's it called? There's one nitrogen. It's escaping my head for a minute here. Methanes, okay? All of these are greenhouse gases. More of them in the atmosphere, the hotter Earth gets. That's why everyone raises a big fuss these days about the amount of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, that we are putting in the atmosphere through our activities in our civilization, predominantly the use of fossil fuels. More carbon dioxide means Earth heats up faster. Earth heats up faster, icebergs melt, glaciers melt, ice caps melt, sea levels rise, all sorts of problems. You see our dilemma? So, what would happen if we had no greenhouse gases? What would happen if I could please the Greta Thunbergs of the world? You guys know who she is. Okay? If I could please all of those people and just say, all right, greenhouse gases, whoop, throw you away, put you in a bin, stuff you underground, no longer in the atmosphere, what would happen?
All of our heat would just go back. Like it.
It wouldn't retain
Yeah.
heat.
We couldn't retain our heat. And therefore, what would happen to the Earth? Ice, ice, baby. Right? Don't worry, I won't break into rap here today.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
I'm recording.
Yeah, I think I did that last semester, didn't I? Emily's like, yes, you did. Okay. Yeah. And this has happened, as a matter of fact. We call this period of time Snowball Earth. Why do we call it Snowball Earth? Because practically the entire planet was covered in ice. Only a thin little band of liquid water remained around the equator. Everything else, ice. And why? Because life. Life happened. Snowball Earth happened shortly. We can see this in the fossil record. Shortly after we see a massive increase in the amount of bacteria and algal colonies that spread across the planet. They started going everywhere. And what were they doing? They were pulling all these yummy, yummy greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, photosynthesizing the crap out of them, spitting oxygen back up. And all that oxygen, not a greenhouse gas. You're reducing the number of greenhouse gases, putting the number of not greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Boom, bada boom. Lose your heat. Ergo, Snowball Earth. That's what happens if we have little to no greenhouse gases. On the other extreme, Venus. You remember what I told you on Tuesday last time? Remember what I told you Venus was? Why it was the way it is? Huh?
Like the amount of methane, like gas.
The amount of what gases? Which type of gases? Yeah, I was, thank you. Greenhouse gases, okay? Venus suffers from what apparently is a runaway greenhouse gas effect. It is so hot, not because it has so much solar radiation hitting it. I mean, it's got more hitting it than Earth does. If it was not suffering from this effect and you were standing on Venus right now, your average temperature would probably be around, I don't know, 180, 200 degrees. Still very uncomfortable, but technically livable if you had the right habitat, right? And then on the night side, way colder than that, right? Some temperature extremes there maybe. But the temperature on Venus is way hotter than that. Far, far hotter than the amount of radiation it receives can account for. Why? Because its atmosphere is practically all greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide. Okay? And therefore, the radiation that does make it through the atmosphere never leaves. Boom, 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 zip, 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 zip. All that energy gets absorbed, and you have an extremely hot planet. Hotter than the radiation that's hitting it can account for, because that radiation isn't allowed to escape through the atmosphere. So we have those two extremes of no greenhouse gases and so many and so much greenhouse gases that you get the Venus effect there. Okay, an extremely hot planet. Okay, any questions about atmosphere and how that can play a role in habitats? The quantity of gases, the ratio of gases in our atmosphere can define a lot about how life can develop and move forward. It's possible that Venus has life that has adapted to that environment. We have bacteria here on Earth that can survive Venus conditions. They survive in conditions that are near Venus-like. Heck, we have the technology to genetically modify those extremophile bacteria so we would know for sure they could survive in Venus-like conditions. We could do that, throw them in a Tupperware, and then ship it off to Venus to crash on Venus and start life over there if there isn't life already. Why don't we do that? No one's quite willing to play God yet. And if we did do that, how do we know we wouldn't already be disrupting an ecosystem there? Right? We have to be very, very careful with the things that we do when we interact with our celestial neighbors. Right? Not only for the reason of we don't know if we could piss someone off, but we don't know what we could be doing. We don't want to make a mistake that we regret later. Right? All right. As I mentioned earlier, the elevation affects the amount of and diversity of life. You increase elevation, you decrease the amount and diversity of life as you go upward. Not only is this because of temperature and pressure drop and all of that, again, those are the most likely factors, but we haven't quite been able to quantify the reason yet. The distance from water sources plays a big role in what can live there. Do you see any cacti growing in the Amazon rainforest? No. Do you see any mahogany trees growing in Odessa, Texas? No. Aaron's thinking about it. It's like, I did see my neighbor had that. Yeah. Probably not mahogany. Okay. And so the type of things that can grow in habitats is dependent upon not only water, not only temperature and pressure and things like that, but also where is my water source? How often do I get rain? Right? Okay. Just some examples of those bands as they stretch across our planet. Okay. This red area here, we typically would refer to that as the tropics. And the tropics are typically between 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit and have high moisture content. They get a lot of rain. That's an average, by the way. It gets hotter than that. It gets colder than that. It's an average. A desert, which is this blue area here, and you can see that there's some overlap. Where there's overlap, that's where we would call that like your savannas or grasslands, okay? Deserts, those are places that receive less than 25 centimeters of rain per year. That's not much. That's about 2.5 inches of rain per year, okay? And they have wide temperature extremes. Why do you suppose temperatures have big temperature extremes? Why would it get really hot, but also really cold at night? I'll give you a hint. This ties into something we were talking about, a greenhouse gas and the effect that it has.
Oh, because there's not much plants.
It's not because of the plants.
Because the atmosphere doesn't hold that much greenhouse gases.
What greenhouse gas is relevant in a desert environment? What's one of the most common ones I told you about?
Carbon dioxide.
Not carbon dioxide. That's one everyone thinks of.
Nitrogen?
Huh?
Nitrogen?
No? Someone said it. I think I heard someone. Huh?
You said methane.
No? What'd you say? Not nitrogen.
Water?
Water. Remember, water vapor is a greenhouse gas, right? How much water vapor is there in desert atmosphere? Hardly none. So how much water vapor is there to absorb the heat and keep it there at night? Hardly any. So during the day when the sun is just beating down, yeah, it's going to be hot, but at night, that dry air isn't going to hold any of that any of that heat. That is the ground, right? And so that heat's gone, it gets real cold. You ever notice that happens around here? We get real hot days. What was our hottest day this year? Like 107, 109 this summer? It got bad, right? And last summer too. Whew. I was doing landscaping. I remember, right? But then also, we've had negative temperatures here before. When I worked in North Dakota in the oil field up in Williston, don't recommend, I would work in 100+ degree days in the summer, and in the winter, I did night shifts in -40 degrees. Does that sound fun?
I looked at it after a while.
Oh, I did. Many, many layers. Yeah, no. That's frostbite in 30 seconds for skin that's exposed, in case you're wondering. Nothing could be exposed. It made for an interesting experience, huh?
How do you see this, like goggles?
Goggles. Also, like some people wore goggles. If it was really windy, I would wear goggles because the wind chill can affect your eyes, like hurt your eyes because of the extra effect. When it wasn't windy and it's like -40 degrees, you're okay without goggles. Your eyes hurt because of the cold, but as long as you're blinking, like nothing's gonna happen, right? If I had just like laid out there and not blinked for like 2 minutes, I'm sure my eyes would have had severe problems, but okay, where those overlaps occurred, right? Where your deserts and tropics overlap, that's where you have things like your savannas. And depending on which continent and how much water you get, your sort of forest areas, okay? Savannas look like that, typical in places like Africa. We also have these in the United States. We tend to refer to them as prairies or grasslands, okay? There is not enough moisture for there to be trees, but there is enough for grass and bushes and scrub and all of that. Then you've got your forests, and your forests come in a couple of different flavors, okay? You've got your coniferous forests like this. These tend to be further north or further south, right? Depending on your hemisphere, closer to the poles. Excuse me. Okay, mostly pine trees, conifers, Christmas trees sort of looking things, right? Then you've got your temperate forests. These tend to be closer to your equator. Your oak trees, your sycamore trees, okay? Your fruiting trees, flowering trees, okay? This is a picture from Georgia. Beautiful. Those are the trees that change color in the fall that we all love to see. And if you've never seen it at some point in your life, please, please, please drive across Massachusetts in late September. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. All right, and then we've got tundra. This is where you get real far south or north or real far south, right? Practically in the polar regions. This is like pre-polar regions, okay? So a tundra is where you have permafrost. Remember, permafrost is where most of your topsoil remains frozen year-round. Only the top few inches ever thaw, which means that you can't get real plants. There is no grass. There's no bushes. There's no trees. Really, the only vegetation that you see are patches of moss. Why? Moss don't have root systems, at least not really to speak of. They only need those top few inches of soil to be unfrozen for them to survive. Plants are incredibly important resources for us to study in the fossil record so that we can put together models of what these environments looked like, what their conditions were like, temperature, precipitation rates. How can we do that? Isotopes. Carbon-12 and 13 and oxygen-16 and 18 isotopes are often used to gather not only temperature information, but also precipitation rates. Let me give you an example. Oxygen, where's oxygen on our periodic table of elements? Right there, 8. What's its mass? 16. It's 15.9994, but we typically round that to 16. That's a couple of electrons, right? It's 16. We'll call it 16. Oxygen 16 is your normal version of oxygen. Oxygen 18 is what? 2 more neutrons, and we call this an isotope. Thank you. Oxygen 18 is an isotope of oxygen 16 with 2 more neutrons. You are correct. Which one has more mass? Oxygen 18, the isotope. Therefore, if I have a molecule of water that is made with an isotope of oxygen 18 versus oxygen 16, which one has more mass? The molecule of water made with oxygen 18. And therefore, which one is more likely to fall out of the atmosphere sooner? The oxygen 18 isotope. So using this logic, which we've proven through modern day studies, we can tell that the further you get from the equator, where remember, there's more rain happening at the equator, and the further you get away north or south, the less rain that happens. The further you get from the equator, the more oxygen 16 you will see in the rain versus oxygen 18, which because it had more mass, rained out sooner, aka nearer the equator. Further north or further south away from your equator, more 16. So how does that help us in the fossil record? Well, believe it or not, some of those oxygens are saved in the structure of your plant. You remember how it's using those carbons and oxygens to build its structure? Yeah? So if I do a carbon isotope analysis of a plant fossil, and I find that this plant fossil is made from a lot more oxygen 16s than 18s. Other way, it wasn't near the equator. More 16s than 18s. The lighter isotope was present more than the heavier isotope. If it was heavy in oxygen 18 isotopes, I would know that at that point, when this plant was alive, this area of the world that I found that fossil in was at or near the equator. Isn't that cool? You can use something as obscure as an isotope and how massive it is, its atomic mass, to figure out how close to the equator this plant was when it was alive. That's crazy. And because I know how close to the equator that plant was, I know how close that region of the world was, which helps me reconstruct tectonics. Boom. Cool? It's cool. Sorry, I think it's cool. This is what my thesis was. I think I told you the other day. I did an analysis of ostracods, which are tiny little crustaceans, about the size of, I don't know, what would you say? A grain of sand, maybe slightly bigger than that, some of them. And I did a carbon and oxygen isotope analysis to reconstruct a paleoclimate for Eastern Oregon, what is now Eastern Oregon, right? It was pretty cool. Isotopes are fun. It took a long time, but they're fun. Another thing that we can figure out is because a lot of these plant species have supplemental, I guess you could say, descendant species today, like cabbage palms. We have cabbage palms everywhere. You can buy them at a local nursery, right? You can have them in your yard. They'll do quite well here, right? But there are also cabbage palms from the Jurassic, as a matter of fact, I believe, or the Cretaceous. I think they were also in the Jurassic. But during the Cretaceous, I remember reading an article not long ago about how they think cabbage palms were Triceratops' favorite food. Right? Pretty cool. And we still have those today. So because we know where cabbage palms like to live now and the environments that they survive in well, when I find a cabbage palm fossil, I can reasonably assume that that layer of rock represents an environment that is similar to the same one that cabbage palms like today. Okay, plants, really useful. Marine environments. Remember, marine means anything in the ocean. We can make interpretations of marine environments through a couple of ways. We can study the way that our marine environments behave and have ecosystems in them now, right? So different temperature variations, different salinities. What's my overall water chemistry, right? What's my prey to predator relationship we have today? And I can make interpretations about past environments by looking at the rock. Is it shale or is it limestone? Is it sandstone? That gives me basic depth information, right? What sort of chemistry is present in the fossils in the fossils that are in that layer of rock? That gives me information about maybe how salty the water was. Am I receiving more silica, or is there more silica shells, or are there more calcite shells? Temperature variation, right? All of these things. It's very difficult to tell things like currents or tides from a fossil record. There are some things that give us clues for that. The presence of tidal flats in the geologic record. We can tell by looking at the sediments and the fossils there if this was a tidal flat or not, right? But currents, very difficult to tell through geologic history. Really, we can only determine those based upon likely scenarios of temperature variation, as we can see in the fossil record, and where the coastlines were, because currents tend to wander along coastlines. Here, I'll show you right here. So here you can see our modern day currents, okay? So we've got warm, these orange lines, those are the warm currents that get circulated around the Pacific out here, the Atlantic out here, right? And then the Indian out here. These blue lines, those are your cold water currents. You can see where they come up across California and then over here around the East Coast and up here around the Antarctic Ocean. Now, at one point in time, Central America wasn't there, okay? That didn't exist. It's only there because of the amount of volcanoes that are present there, okay, from tectonic plate interaction. When that was not there, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean were able to intermix. And so our currents looked totally different until Panama, the Isthmus of Panama was formed, and it isolated these two oceans from each other. Now they don't intermix, which has changed a whole bunch of things, not the least of which is the Atlantic Ocean tends to be saltier than the Pacific Ocean, okay? All right, the depth of water also plays a role in what things can live there. There are 3 zones, okay, that in the depth of water that you need to know. The tidal zone, which is where you are right next to land, and when the tide is out, you're exposed, and when the tide is in, you are underwater, okay? That's your tidal zone. A lot of things live there. Then you've got your photic zone. Anyone remember what the photic zone is? I explained this the other day.
No light.
No light,
No sun.
no sun.
No, the exact
No, right.
opposite.
Huh?
Where sun hits.
Yes, it's where the sun is.
Oh.
Yeah, okay. It's not that there's no light or no sun. It's that the photic zone is the furthest that the sun can go, right? That column of water that has some amount of light, and that will vary between 300 to 600 feet, depending on where you are, okay? How clear your water is, for example, okay? That's the photic zone. A lot of things have to live in there. Anything that is photosynthesizing has to live in the photic zone. So if coral are photosynthetic, right? They rely upon the presence of light. Are you typically going to find coral reefs below 600 feet? No, you're not. So when I find a coral reef in the fossil record, what's that a good indicator of for me? How deep was the water there? It was within the photic zone. You see how we're taking these principles that we can observe and see today and using them to reconstruct the past? I know I point that out a lot, but I'm really trying to drive it home, okay? This is how geologists work. This is how paleontologists work. This is how we learn more about the history of our planet. And then there's the benthos. The benthos is the bottom of the sea, okay? When I say that there was a benthic organism, that means that it lives on or very close to the bottom of the ocean. Let's talk about our food chain in the ocean for a second. It all starts with the producers. Planktons, dinoflagellates, coccolithophores, radiolarians, foraminiferans, all of these different groups that people just all lump into the same category as plankton. If you really want to get into it, there's plankton, and then there's zooplankton. Phytoplankton, zooplankton, okay? Zooplankton tend to be larger and prey upon the phytoplankton fairly often, okay? Then you've got the next step up, tiny little animals and suspension feeders, okay? Your little larvae of fish and other animals, and your suspension feeders like sea anemones that just kind of like drift in the current, or your crinoids, right, that drift in the current. Anything that is just catching stuff out of the ocean, those are filter feeders, or those are suspension feeders, okay? They're just eating whatever the current brings to them, okay? And they're usually eating those phytoplanktons and zooplanktons. Then you've got grazers. These just kind of wander around the bottom of the ocean, eating whatever garbage is there, dead stuff, other living things that are too slow to get away. It's hard to, you have to be really slow to not escape a sea cucumber. But there are things that are slower than sea cucumbers, right? Deposit feeders, gastropods like snails. They'll typically go around eating a lot of the organic waste from other organisms, okay? As a matter of fact, this might be a gross story for some of you. Crinoids, the sea lilies, right? They have a stalk, then they've got a whole bunch of like flower-like tendrils, and all those flower-like tendrils grab food and bring it in towards the central body, which is called a calyx. I have a right here. Okay, this is a fossil crinoid. But you see the little tendrils, the tentacles there. This body, that is the calyx. So those tendrils will grab food, bring it in, and then it'll eat it through the mouth. There's only one hole for these organisms. For most of these organisms, there's only one hole. It's called a cloaca, right? You eat and poop out of it, right? So it eats its food, brings it down into the mouth, and then digests it there, right? There are snails that climb up, slowly make their way up the stalk of the crinoid, settle in around the crown, and then stick their mouth down into the crinoid's mouth, which is also its butthole, and eat the food before the crinoid can. The tendrils bring it into the mouth, and then the snail snags it before it can make it to the digestive system of the crinoid. What an amazing adaptation. / awful for the crinoid. Sorry, buddy. Right? But that is how the snail do. Okay. Then you've got your larger carnivores, your ammonites, sharks, whales, all of those that float around in the ocean, okay? So your benthic organisms, grazers, suspensions, and depositizers, those are benthic. And then you've got photic organisms, like your whales and your squid and your sharks and your fish floating around, normally hanging out in the photic zone. Most of that life hangs out in the photic zone. There are organisms that are free-floating hunters, like sharks, like squid, like whales, and they live deep, deep, deep down under the photic zone. They look crazy. There are some crazy looking things down there, but they live down there. They've adapted to live in the dark. It's incredible. Studying those things is a rabbit hole, man. I've had to pull myself out of that rabbit hole a few times. And it's like, wait, how does that live down there? How have they lived down there for this long? And a lot of those things live down there for a very long time for some reason. They're studying exactly how it can be that organisms can live for so long down there without access to light. All right, let's talk about salinity here. First of all, temperature variations, right? For water, the same as it is on land, the further you get from the equator, the colder your water gets. Easy to understand. But what about salinity? Remember I told you before that when this wasn't there and this ocean and that ocean were connected, they shared the same salinity level. And now this ocean is more saline, more salty than that one, right? Water circulation controls salinity. Also, how much ice there is. Why would how much ice there is control salinity? What does it have to do with the freezing point of water?
It doesn't get evaporated.
You can evaporate salt water, but what does it leave behind?
Salt.
Salt. Any of y'all ever tasted frozen salt water?
Taste what?
Frozen salt water.
Frozen salt water?
Yeah. Have you ever tasted it? No, because you can't. You can only freeze fresh water. The salt stays behind. And so if I am freezing water in the ocean, that ocean is salty. The more of that ocean I freeze, the more salty the remaining water gets. Following me here? So during an ice age where water temperatures have fallen, more ice is forming, do my oceans get more or less salty? More salty. And during a period of global warming, where my ice is melting back into the ocean, my water gets more or less salty, right? Okay, so there are a couple of things that can dictate the salinity of my water. When something is okay, so typically when ocean water is between 30,000 to 40,000 parts per million of salt. Okay, when it is too fresh, we call that brackish water. You'll see that term applied to water where rivers empty into oceans. Okay, because you're bringing fresh water into that salt water. So there at that interface, we'll typically call that brackish water. And then when it's too salty, it's called hypersaline. Think Dead Sea. If you don't know what the Dead Sea looks like, you should look up pictures of it. Okay? Literally so much salt that the beaches are made out of salt. Okay?
You can't drown in there, right?
It's hard to swim in the Dead Sea because you float, right? You float extremely easily. You are more buoyant in salt water than you are in fresh water. For freshwater ecosystems, what we call fresh water is anything less than 500 parts per million of salt. Above that, up to that 30,000, right? That's brackish. Below 500 is fresh. You and I can drink that and not even really notice that there's any salt in it. Interesting fun fact. Most bottled water companies actually put a little bit of salt in their water to make you thirsty. So you keep drinking their water. Dirty, dirty trick. They call them electrolytes and say, we're doing you a favor. There are not very many phytoplanktons or zooplanktons that live in fresh water. The vast majority are in salt water. So there's a different sort of food chain dynamic in fresh water. It more has to do with algae. Algae typically form the bottom of your food chain in freshwater ecosystems. You'll have things that eat the algae, and then you have fish that eat those things, and so on and so forth, okay? There are less diverse groups of organisms that have adapted to live in fresh water. Why? Well, because life started in the oceans, right? And moved into fresh water from there. And how much less fresh water is there than there is ocean? A lot less. Way, 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 way less fresh water, right? And so there isn't as much living space. The apartment building isn't as big, right? Fewer niches to occupy, and therefore diversity has less chance to occur, to spread. On top of that, it's very difficult for us to make interpretations about past freshwater ecosystems because, I mean, how small is a lake geographically speaking, right? Like, yeah, they're small. They're tiny little packages of water. And sure, they've gotten depositional layers of sediment and whatnot, and there are fossils in those probably. But what's the likelihood that I, a geologist, on my way out into the world, am I going to happen to step on that small little pocket of rock out there amongst the massive quantities of other continental and oceanic rock that has ever been laid down? Doesn't happen that often. And so it's hard for us to interpret stuff about past freshwater ecosystems because there is less of that than there is, say, ocean ecosystem evidence. Make sense? Okay. Any questions about that? Any questions? Yeah.
Is it also hard because freshwater ecosystems like a river just move a bunch and it's hard to track down?
It can be difficult to determine courses, but actually we can tell that by looking at the directions that the sediment was deposited in and kind of walking backwards and making a cross section of that, because you can see where layer upon layer of river was deposited on top, right?
And ain't salt like preserve more the meat and like the body, like preserve it more, make it last longer.
What does?
Salt.
Oh, does salt preserve meat? Yes, it does. Salt is a hostile material to organisms that would typically spoil things like meat. That's why in the olden days, before refrigerators, you would store your meat in salt. It would prevent decay. because none of the organisms that would go and eat that meat could survive that salty condition. Okay, so that's a lecture. Let me introduce you to your next lab. Bless you.
Thank you.
All right, lab 3. Where are you at? There you are. Okay, invertebrate fossils. I'm just going to give you the cliff notes on this. Does anyone understand that reference? Cliff notes? No. Cliff notes were a series of books that they came out with that explained complicated subjects in like 50 pages or less. So there was Cliff Notes Astrophysics, Cliff Notes Geology, Cliff Notes Shakespeare, all of that. Very, very useful. Basically, when I say I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version, I'm giving you a summary because all the information you need is on these slides. And instead of just walking you through each slide, essentially reading off the slide, I'm just going to introduce you to the subject and tell you how to do it. Okay? So invertebrate fossils are those that are from organisms that had no backbone, right? And the geologic record, the fossil record of invertebrates is far, far, far longer than the geologic record of vertebrates. So we are starting off by learning about the different groups of invertebrate organisms. And then from there, we will move into vertebrates because I kind of want you to see the sequence of the way that these things developed. Okay, and that's what Module 3 is all about. Okay, so about 571 million years ago is the oldest invertebrate fossil, single-celled or multi-celled organism like a bacterial algal mat, right? That's where we start to first see actual things like sponges and all of that come forward. Okay, what hard parts are preserved? Typically shells. There are some endoskeletal structures, chitin, which is like what crab shell is made out of, all of that. Those hard parts are what are preserved. Obviously, very difficult to find preserved soft tissues. Remember what we call that? Lagerstätten. It's such a fun word. Say it with me. Lagerstätten. Isn't that a fun word to say? Yeah. Germans have all the fun words. Okay. Plus, everything that you say sounds like you're angry all the time. All right, so this is the branch of our tree of life that this lab encompasses. Cnidaria, Arthropoda, Mollusca, all of that incorporated in that particular tree of life. So, brachiopods and bivalves are mollusks. Think clam-like organisms, clams, oysters, etc. Okay? The easiest way to tell them apart, because they can be confusing, I'm just going to give you this rule of thumb right now. The easiest way to tell them apart is that brachiopods are not symmetrical side to side. If I'm looking at them side on, I cannot cut it in half symmetrically. The two halves do not meet like that. They are not exact copies of each other side to side. However, from the top down and the front, they are. Here's a front view, perfectly symmetrical. Top down, perfectly symmetrical. Bottom up, perfectly symmetrical. With a bivalve, it's the opposite. From the side to side, they are perfectly symmetrical. From the top down, or from the front, they are not symmetrical. From the top down and the bottom up, not symmetrical. Brachiopod, bivalve. Both organisms formed from two shells that interlock. But they're what? Yes, but that's soft tissues, and we can't examine that in a fossil, can we? Right. So, brachiopod, not symmetrical to the side, but symmetrical top down and from the front. Bivalve, yes, is symmetrical side to side, but not symmetrical from the front or the top. You with me? And if you ever get confused, just come back to the slide. This is the PowerPoint that I've given you for the lab. Okay? Then we've got nautiloids and ammonoids, and these get confused a lot as well. They are both cephalopods that curl in on themselves to make the structure for the animal. Back when this was a living thing, there was a squid that came out of this. Okay, this is what a nautiloid or a brachiopod would look like, or a nautiloid or an ammonoid. Okay, squid animal coming out of this opening chamber. These individual chambers are called septa. Okay, and between each septa, each chamber, are sutures, these lines. Each time a new chamber would grow, as this animal would grow, it would build a new chamber to increase the size of the shell to accommodate how big it was getting. Each time that it would build one out, a suture would form between the old chamber and the new one. So your animal is living in these chambers. And in the older chambers that the animal was not inside of, it would fill those with gases. Okay? Those gases helped it remain buoyant in the water. More gas, it floated higher. Less gas, it dropped lower in the water, like a submarine does. That's how we change the depth for submarines. Okay? So how do we tell the difference between a nautiloid and an ammonoid? Easiest ways to tell are the sutures in ammonoids tend to be a lot more elaborate, especially as time goes on. It's fascinating to study this because you see the sutures in ammonoids go from being just kind of basic like that to more wavy like this until finally, right before they went extinct with the dinosaurs, by the way, right before they went extinct, their sutures looked like this, or kind of like almost tree-shaped. Why do you suppose they would do that? For fun, he says. Probably not. That's not how evolution works. What possible advantage could there be for these sutures to be so complicated? For it to have existed and to have only gotten more elaborate over time, it had to have given them a positive advantage.
The structure of the shell was a lot stronger, right?
Why would the structure of the shell be a lot stronger?
The pressure.
Not so much, I mean, kind of,
Stress.
what kind of stress?
Differential stress, like equal.
Well, we're not talking about rocks right now. Yeah. What kind of pressure? What could cause pressure on a shell? A predator biting on that shell to get at the nice, juicy squid dude inside. The more interlocked the parts of my shell are, the more difficult it is for a predator to break my shell apart and eat me, right? So yes, a huge positive evolutionary advantage for those sutures to be more complicated and interlocked. So as time goes on, we see that in ammonoids. This is a relatively simple version of that. I have much more complicated versions scattered around the room if you want to see any of them in a little bit. Or for those of you watching this online, just look up complicated or complex ammonite sutures. Okay, you'll see that. It's very dendritic, like the branches of a tree. So nautiloids, never got those, never developed those. That was an ammonite thing. Also, ammonite sutures tend to be overall concave towards the back of the shell. So you see how it kind of starts off concave this way and then it kind of dives in, but then ends up concave that way? For a nautiloid, they are concave towards the opening of the shell. Okay? Those are the two easiest ways to determine whether you're looking at an ammonoid or a nautiloid. Okay?
Were they like in the general like same locations?
Nautiloids came first. Ammonoids diversified off of them. But ammonoids died out with the dinosaurs. Nautiloids are endangered but still alive today. This is actually a nautiloid shell. A couple of decades old. But they are still alive in the oceans. Endangered, like I said. Yeah. This is what it looks like when it's carved in half. Look at this.
Become more complex.
Huh?
Become more complex.
No, because this is a nautiloid. Ammonoids were the ones that got the complex sutures, right?
But they haven't evolved like the nautiloids from, like
They haven't changed that much, no. No. But look at their sutures. Concave towards the opening of the shell, like I told you, right? All right. We have a variety of different corals. I'm not going to go into these that much because all the information is there, right? Corals, the scleractinian corals, those are the ones we have in the oceans today. Sponges, very long fossil record. I told you before that invertebrate fossils, we can confirm that they were at least 571 million years ago. There is strong suspicion, excuse me, that sponges could have started as much as 600 million years ago. So I have that date on here. Those dates are going to be relevant for the lab, by the way. Bryozoans, these are animals that created structures very similar to coral. It's interesting because the actual animals, the bryozoan animals themselves, look very different from the coral animals, but they made very similar looking structures. Gastropods, these are your snails, right? That's a fossilized snail. Slugs as well, because slugs didn't have shells. Very, very difficult to find a fossil of those. Belemnoids, these are cephalopods like ammonites, like nautiloids, like squid, like octopi. The big difference between belemnoids and ammonites and nautiloids is that while ammonites and nautiloids had their shells on the outside, belemnoids grew their hard parts on the inside of their body. They made spikes, little aragonite calcite spikes inside of their body. Why would they do that? Was it for defense? It's inside the body. Couldn't really use it for defense, could they? Why would something that swims in the ocean want something heavy inside its body? Yeah, it controlled buoyancy. They would grow the spike and they would be able to sink in the water column. Or they could simply produce some gases from the food that they ate and overcome that sinking effect, increase their buoyancy. So where the ammonites and the nautiloids would have their shell on the outside and make gases to float up or down, the belemnoids had a different evolutionary decision where they made these spikes to control their sinking effect, and then they would make more gases to overcome its weight. Okay? Belemnoids also went extinct with the dinosaurs. Otherwise, you'd be able to go to Olive Garden and get fried belemnoid. Trilobites. I compare these to those roly-poly bugs from before, right? This is exactly what they did. Roly-poly bugs curl up whenever they feel endangered, right? Come on, camera. Stay with me here. Roly-poly bugs curl up whenever they feel endangered and can simply uncurl themselves whenever they want to get back up and keep going about their business. Trilobites did the same thing. Here's one that died in its rolled up position. There's an unrolled one. There's an unrolled one. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Why the heck does that trilobite have a fork on its face? Forks have 4 prongs. Fork? It's a trident. Yeah. It's Poseidon. No. Why does it have that? That is a fantastic question. Why does it have big spikes? Why does its eyes have fish hooks coming off of them? All great questions. Yes. They could have been used for weaponry, for self-defense. They could have been used for sexual dimorphism to show, hey, I am a male. Don't try to mate with me, right? Or I am a female. Don't try to mate with now. We have no idea why I had a lot of these things, okay? But there are trilobites with the craziest ornamentations. As a matter of fact, trilobites are some of the best index fossils that exist because there is so much crazy variety in how they developed that any species, any particular species, is pretty easily identifiable from the rest of them. They diverged so often and so well. Called trilobites, by the way, because there were three parts of their body: the cephalon, which is the head, the thorax, which is the middle of the body, and the pygidium, which is the butt. Eurypterids were the largest arthropods we know of that have existed, at least of this particular type. 2.5 meters long. Think, let's see, an 8 to 9 foot long scorpion underwater. How many of you just went, nope, in your head? Yeah. Claudia's like, yeah, absolutely not. Never, never. If we ever discover such a thing, Claudia's getting on a spaceship and going to Mars. She's like, I am done with this planet. Okay. These were apex predators for a long time. And we actually also see evidence of the fact that they were able to go on land, which is cool. Because as far as we know, when they showed up, not much else was. Barnacles. Barnacles are actually a very close relative to crabs. They are crustaceans. They share most of the same body parts. The only difference is, at some point in time, around 520 million years ago, I guess, they decided, or their ancestors, I should say, decided, you know what, we're just going to stay in one spot. We're homebodies. We're just going to grow a shell around ourselves and just, be suspension feeders. Whereas their cousins were like, nah, we got to go see the world. And they became the crabs and the lobsters and the shrimp and all of those other crustaceans. All right, insects started off just land dwelling. Okay. They are arthropods as well, by the way, just like trilobites and eurypterids and crustaceans and all of those. But when they moved up onto land, it wasn't that long until they started flying. Okay. They grew wings and they took off. As far as we can tell, they were the first airborne organisms. And boy, what free real estate that was. Imagine being the first flying insect and being like, this is all mine, right? It's the way it was. They dominated the air for a long time. By the way, don't confuse insects with other arthropods. Insects are their own group. Arthropods cover a large group on its own. Arthropods and arachnids are different. Okay, spiders are arachnids. How many pairs of legs do spiders have? Well, they have 8 legs, but 4 pairs, right? Okay, how about insects? 3 pairs, right? Okay, remember that. Spiders, not insects. Okay. And then, of course, we've got our plants. Plants have a very long fossil record. Algae. Plants came from algae. First groups of algae that started growing up onto shorelines were about 850 million years ago. The first actual evidence that we have of sporing plants living on land was about 470 million years ago. Big plants, they started getting big about 445 million years ago, actually being able to leave the water instead of staying in the water. And then non-vascular plants about 425 million years ago. That means like ferns. Vascular, by the way, you familiar with the term vascular? You and I are vascular because we have a heart that pumps blood through our bodies. What's a vascular plant, though? They don't have hearts. No, but they do have a system that pumps water and sap through their bodies. That's what vascularization is. Non-vascular plants have to live with their roots permanently in sources of water. Vascular plants don't. And when vascular plants came around, they were able to spread out onto land and leave the coast behind. Okay, so that happened. Gymnosperm forests appeared about 319 million years ago, is where they started getting very widespread. Angiosperms didn't show up until 140 million years ago. Flowering plants didn't show up until the last age of the dinosaurs. Okay. Grasses didn't develop until about 129 million years ago. By the way, grasses are a kind of angiosperm. They are flowering plants. Okay. By the way, grasses also include rice and bamboo. You guys know that? Rice is a kind of grass. Bamboo is a kind of grass. All right. So your assignment, you've got a series of questions to answer. You have another table to fill out. And yeah, easy. This is going to be your friend. This PowerPoint is going to be your friend, as is the Lab 4 PowerPoint. Important note here. Lab 3 and 4 are tied together. You may not necessarily have all the information you need to finish this lab in a week, and that is okay. If you want to wait to finish Lab 3 until I've given you officially Lab 4, that's fine with me. I'm not going to nitpick that. It's just that both of the labs, because I didn't want to do one huge mega lab, I cut it in half. That's really it, okay? So think of it this way. You have 2 weeks to do labs 3 and 4 instead of 1 week for 3 and 1 week for 4. Fair? Great. Any questions? Fantastic. Well, I'm going to end the recording here then because I've been talking for, what, 2 hours?